Good to see everybody here this morning. I was watching the kids. I forgot to mention, I meant to repeat this. Every time I get a compliment, I like to pass it on. When Jeff Walling was here, he was so impressed with the way we had the kids up front. He even got his phone out and took a picture. He said, I visit a lot of churches in the Southern California area, and that was the first time I'd seen that. A whole bunch of young children up on stage singing before the congregation. He was really encouraged by that. And so I know we find it encouraging every Sunday, but it's just great to see them up here. It's just, it always helps me get a little more energized for the lesson this morning. We're still in Genesis, talking about Joseph. And this message is called The Due Time. How many know what the due time is? The cheaters. They've heard this before. But we're going to talk about the due time, but you got to wait for it. Look for it in here. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I back up? There we go. Sometime later, the cupbearer and baker of the king of Egypt offended their master. It's never a good idea to offend the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry with the two of his officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, or butler, or whatever you want to call it, put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was being confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended to them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in the prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials, who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why are your faces so sad today?" You ever had one of those dreams? We both had dreams, they answered, but there is no one to interpret them for us. Then Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dream." So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, "In my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup and put the cup in his hand." "This is what it means," Joseph said to him. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer." Nice dream, nice interpretation. "But when all goes well, remember me and show me kindness. Mention to me to Pharaoh to get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." "This is what it means," Joseph said. 3 days, 3 baskets, or 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and hang you on a tree." I don't think that's what he was looking for. "And the birds will eat away your flesh." Probably not the interpretation he was hoping for. Now on the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he was once again put the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. I mean, once again, you've got this horrible situation. And it looks like it could get better. It looks like a break for Joseph. Things are looking good, except the cupbearer forgets the whole thing. Just sort of says, hey, he got out, he got excited, everything was going good, and he forgot Joseph in the prison. And all through Genesis, there's these phrases where it says God remembered Noah. God remembered Abraham. God remembered Rachel when she couldn't have children. God remembers. But people forget. People will let you down. People that you count on will let you down. But God remembers. You've got some interesting things going on in the story. In the time of Pharaoh, in these times, interpretations were something that people specialized in. There were magicians, there were seers, there were monks that sat on rocks that could interpret dreams. People would come and give them gifts and tell them their dreams, and they would interpret. That was sort of the way it went. There were people who were experts on dream interpretation. But Joseph makes a rather unusual claim in that time. You see, when they all had professional dream interpreters, with billboards and signs and advertising out, Joseph says, do not interpretations belong to God. Tell me your dream. But he doesn't claim he can do it. He says they belong to God. Tell me your dream, God will give me the answer. Do not interpretations belong to God. That was a challenge. This was a strange thing to say to a cupbearer and a baker in Pharaoh's palace. They had professionals that handled these things, and here was this slave and now prisoner, and telling them, hey, interpretations actually belong to God. And that was an unusual thing, a challenge. You see, they had their way of doing things. I find it fascinating. You think, way back then they had people that interpret dreams. Isn't it funny that we still have these, psychics on the street corners? You pass signs all the time where people claim they can tell you, or interpret your dreams, interpret your life, tell you your future. That we seem to still be fascinated with this sort of thing. And they had their way of doing it. And Joseph is challenging that system. He's saying, no, that God is the one who interprets dreams, not human beings. And that's what we all need to hear. As the listening community, as we read through the scriptures, we need to recognize that we are called to challenge the system. That the message of God is a countercultural challenge. It bucks the system. I remember being in Kenya where we would talk about these things, and I would talk about, well, now here's something in your culture that is very godly. They're very group-oriented, they're very family-oriented, they're very people-oriented. But then there were some other aspects of their culture that were not. And we'd have to talk about that. And invariably, one of them would say, well, what about your culture, Jolliff? Does your culture have any problems with it? And you had to be ready for that question. Because if you were saying, oh, well, see, the American culture is just totally Christian. We have no problems whatsoever. See, they know that's not true. And I'd have to talk about, well, we've got our hang-ups with materialism and a lot of other situations, and I would list off a few, and here's the ones that are very similar to the Kenyans. I said, materialism is common in America, but it's also common in Kenya. And we talk about that. But the fact is, the Christian message goes countercultural to any culture around the world. And I think one of the problems we struggle with here in America is we've often been told we live in a Christian culture. Or we've often been told we were founded on Christian principles, which indeed we were, but the people in operation, the people still working the system, become corrupt. And the system still needs to be challenged by godly principles. It has always needed to be challenged by godly principles. If you really go back to the forefathers of our nation, those who wrote the Constitution, they assumed a biblical background to those documents. And if the Bible is taken away from those documents, they become very inadequate. They can be interpreted very strange ways. And we need to always recognize, no matter how godly your background has been, we're still worldly. We're still weak, selfish sinners, and we still need to be challenged by a countercultural message of the Scriptures. Interpretations belong to God, not to man. And Joseph tells the cupbearer, the butler, whatever you want to call him, that he's going to be restored in 3 days. That's good news. And I don't know if you're like me, but I have freaky dreams. And you know, some of them have some meaning to them. I only figure it out, a couple months later. I look back and realize, hey, that dream had a lot to do with this situation. But then I have other dreams that just cannot possibly be related. I have dreams where I'm in Kenya, but with one of my high school friends and some of my friends from Pepperdine. And they never were in Kenya, and I was never doing anything with them here that would relate to that. You wake up and you think, where did that come from? But they have deeper meanings, and Joseph is someone who's familiar with dreams. And I think sometimes we need to be careful, but I do think we need to pay a little more attention. As one psychology book I read said, dreams are often the way your mind works things out, things that you can't work out while you're conscious. That something you're frustrated with in your conscious mind, your dreams work out unconsciously. And sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad. But we need to pay a little more attention, because I think God does try to get our attention sometimes, even in our dreams. But don't get too crazy with it either. This could be Joseph's big break. I mean, he gives this great interpretation. This guy is connected to the king, who can let anybody out of prison he wants to. Things are looking good. Now, this is great for both of them. And Joseph even knows. He says, now listen, when things go well for you, remember me, show me kindness, mention me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this prison. For I was forcibly carried from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put into the dungeon. Now, part of you might say, well, everybody in prison says that. I'm innocent. I didn't do it. But in this case, Joseph is right, and this gives us a little indication about how he feels. Just the way he says, hey, I was taken from the land, I was kidnapped, and even ending up in the dungeon, I didn't deserve. So this is sort of one of those little insights we get that Joseph didn't feel like he was being treated justly. He felt like he was in the wrong place and that he was suffering unjustly. And so we're met with this little conflict as we look through this. See, it's really clear that Joseph believes in and trusts Yahweh. I mean, he clearly, when he told Potiphar's wife, it's a sin against my master and it's a sin against God. I mean, he had a solid morality based on his relationship with God. He believes in him, trusts in him. He also clearly thinks God's in charge. I mean, even when he's talking to the two Pharaoh's servants, he says, look, interpretations belong to God. Hey, God knows everything. God's in charge. He's in control. See, the problem with this is he has to sort of reconcile a loving, merciful God and his current condition and address. I mean, he's a follower of God. He trusts God. He's trying to serve God. He's got God's morality. He refused to give in to Potiphar's wife. He's doing what God's called him to do, and he's in prison unjustly. And he has to wonder, God, if you're in charge, why am I here? Why am I suffering? If you're in charge, if you gave me these dreams that people would bow down to me, why am I in a dungeon? And why, when I had a perfect opportunity to get out, the cupbearer forgets me? You ever been there? You ever been in a situation where you're thinking, I'm trying to follow God the best I can, and things aren't working out very well? I'm doing all that I know how to be a good Christian, to be a faithful worshiper of Yahweh, and life is ganging up on me. Things aren't working out. Allison's got on the refrigerator. I try to take one day at a time, but they all gang up on me. That's one of those, where things just aren't working out. You're doing what you're supposed to do. You're being as responsible as you can. You're taking care of your job as you can. You're taking care of your relationships as you can. You're serving God as you can. And you're in a prison. You're suffering. You're in a bad marriage. You're in a bad relationship. You got problems with your children or with a sibling or with parents. You've got a problem with a coworker or a boss who's not treating you right. And you had that moment where you're thinking, God, as one lady put it to me once, I'm doing my part. How come God isn't doing his? We struggle with that, don't we? You see, if you're human, particularly if you're a Christian, then I know you've been in these situations. And if you're thinking, I've been a Christian and my life's all been good, I've never had any problems, I would advise everyone around you to move away quickly. Because it's coming. You see, when we claim to follow Jesus, we're often called to live in this tension between a loving and merciful God and a hateful and heartless world, a dark world, filled with evil. And that's why we're here. We've been talking about the two stories that are playing out in the lives of people who worship God. And those two stories play out constantly, and they are at odds with each other, and the world has to be challenged in the face of injustice, in the face of suffering. And yeah, it's hard to defend sometimes. Hey, if you're, you can just see them. Joseph, if you're such a good follower of God, how come you're in the dungeon and I'm getting to go back to be cupbearer? I mean, if your God is so great, how come I'm here and you're there? I always love the response. We aren't really dealing with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but I love it when Nebuchadnezzar calls them in and says, if you don't bow down and worship this idol, I'm going to throw you in the fire. And their response was, well, we worship God and we can't bow down to your idol. And he says, do you think your God will save you from this fiery pit? And their response was pretty much, he could if he wanted to. But even if he doesn't, we're not going to worship your idol. We know who's in charge. And they said it not disrespectfully, but just, look, see, there's God, and there's no one else. And if we have to choose between God and a gold idol that you put up, we're going to have to go with God. We know he's solid and everything else isn't. And yeah, he can save us, but even if he doesn't, that just doesn't matter. We have a relationship with God. We're caught in this tension, and we're called to live in the tension. We're called to proclaim God in the tension. This theme runs throughout the scriptures as we look through, especially if you go to the Psalms. And I want to encourage you, if you're in a rough time, if you're struggling, open the book of Psalms and start reading. And one of the things I've appreciated as you read through those things is it often starts out with these horrible, woe is me, God, why are all these terrible things happening to me? But they always end on a note of praise. But when you start actually talking to God, by the time you get finished, there's really nothing to worry about. It might be bad for a while, but he's going to take care of you. But this theme of remember me, O Lord, or why have you forgotten me? This is Psalms 13. How long, O Yahweh, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and every day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, O Yahweh, my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. My enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing to Yahweh, for he has been good to me. Even when things are tough, and David sure about living in that tension. God told him, you're going to be king, and then he spent the next few years running for his life from the king. It didn't really seem like it was working out the way God had told him. And he wrote a lot of these Psalms in that process. Have you been there? Been in this place? Where you're struggling with that, I know there is a God, I trust God, but boy, things just don't look like they're working out right now. It's not new to anyone, but let's take a look at a few others. Apostle Paul was certainly there. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about the hardships we suffered in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure and beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired even of life. Indeed, in our hearts we felt the sentence of death, but this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He has delivered us from such deadly peril, and he will deliver us. On him we have set our hope that he will continue to deliver us as you help us by your prayers. Then many will give thanks on our behalf for the gracious favor granted us in answer to the prayers of many. Paul's been there. But again, he knows. And I like the way he explains this. This happened so that we would not depend on ourselves. And how often is it that we get into a problem, we get into difficulties, we're confronted with challenges, and we exhaust everything we know how to do. We think, you know what, I got this. I'm going to think about it, I'm going to work it out, I'm going to come up with a plan, I'm going to take care of it. And when finally we've done everything we know how to do, when we've worked every angle, we've tried to use all of our cleverness, all of our wisdom, and things are still not working out, we think, well, guess I'll have to pray about it. When that's the first thing we should do. Let's not depend on ourselves. The Bible's very clear about that. If you're trying to work it out yourself, and if you've gotten to a point in life where you haven't figured out you need help, let me help you out. You need help. I need help. We all need help. That's why God has us get together every Sunday. That's why God had the early Christians get together in fellowship and encourage each other and read the scriptures every day and pray every day, because we need help. But our human arrogance, our human pride, our pull it up by your own bootstraps mentality often is one of the biggest enemies to our faith in God and our relationship with him. The idea that we can do this ourselves, that we've got this, when in fact, the only one that's got it is God. See, being called by God does not mean being called to a life of comfort. And if you thought it did, I'm sorry, someone sold you a false bag of goods. Are there good times as a Christian? Absolutely. Are there rough times as a Christian? Absolutely. And we're called to do it all. This is one of those things we don't like, but we need to learn to deal with. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author of Hebrews tells us. The author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him, get this, the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and then he sat down at the right hand at the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. And you have forgotten the word of encouragement that addresses you as sons, daughters. My son, do not make light of the Lord's discipline, and do not lose heart when he rebukes you, because the Lord disciplines those he loves, And as my mother likes to say, and he really loves me. The Lord disciplines those he loves and he punishes everyone who he accepts as a son. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. The only issue with discipline is, did you learn from it? Do we learn from the hardships and challenges? There's the old saying that some people have 1,000 experiences and others have the same experience 1,000 times because they don't learn. And as long as we don't learn, then we keep getting to experience the same issues. We keep making the same mistakes. I've said this many times, and something else my mother always told me was, you're going to make mistakes. Try to make new ones. Don't keep making the old ones. Then you haven't learned. Make new mistakes. Every day is a new opportunity for new mistakes. But don't repeat the old ones. Learn from them. Conclusion, you've got to prepare for the due time. And I know you've been dying to figure out what that is. Chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. And that's how the chapter ends. And you think, that's a terrible ending to a chapter. You can't end a story like that. You got all these prophecies, you got this movement through, and you get there, and he forgot Joseph. That's because it's not the end of the story. Once again, the story builds the tension. Lets us know that there's that cross between trusting God and enduring the sufferings of this world. The narrative leaves us in that tension between trusting God and human suffering, something all of us will experience. No matter what your situation, there is a God. No matter what your circumstances, you can serve God. You can choose to follow him or not. No matter what. And we need to know that because the no matter what can be pretty bad sometimes. And it can be pretty good sometimes. Now, how do we manage the tension? Peter tells us, humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in the due time. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. This is one of those really awesome verses. It's incredibly encouraging and incredibly disturbing at the same time. It's encouraging in the fact that it says God will lift you up, and if it says God will lift you up, then he will lift you up in the due time. And I looked it up in English and I looked it up in Greek. And due time has no specificity about it whatsoever. It might be a few minutes, might be a few hours, might be a few days. Sometimes it can be years. And it's never fun to be stuck in the due time. But he will lift you up. There is a limit. It doesn't tell us, but God knows the limit. God knows how much we can handle. He knows how much we need. And he has a purpose for doing it. We may not get it, but we can trust him. It is for our good. He is disciplining us because he loves us. And if you're stuck in the due time, you need to read this verse. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand. He will lift you up. I can't tell you how long that's going to take. I've been stuck in the due time for years on occasion. Sometimes for months. Sometimes it doesn't last too long. But God has always lifted me up. Every time. And I know he will. Even though I have no idea how long the due time is. But we need to recognize that when we get stuck in the due time, trust God. Cast your anxieties on him. He cares for you. And it's often in those due times that you think he doesn't. It's often in the due time that you think, God, where are you? Why have you forsaken me? But he cares, like any parent. He doesn't like to see his children hurt, but he also knows that some things are necessary for our growth. So if you find yourself in the due time, trust God. Know that two stories are playing along, and that you're part of the story. You're part of God's story. And you're here to reflect the light of God into a dark world. You're here to tell the world about a loving and merciful God in the face of hatred and heartlessness. And oftentimes we're stuck in the due time so that that message can come through. And that's the message we need to speak and preach no matter what our circumstances. So hang in there. The due time does have a limit. And God will lift us out. Take that message out, because there's a world out there. The world looks hopeless, heartless, doesn't offer many solutions. And they need to hear us talk about the due time. There is a limit, and God will lift us out if we put our trust in him. If you have any needs this morning, please come as we stand and sing.
The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord lift his countenance upon you and give you peace. And give you peace. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious